This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacy.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. The Pharmaceutical Quality Control Laboratory serves as one of the most important functions in pharmaceutical production and control. Poor laboratory practice may yield compliance issues, higher costs, increased cycle time, and delayed product introductions. Avoiding all that means consistent lab review processes and good document controls. Here to review effective laboratory review process and their importance on regulatory compliance is David Strauss of SciCord. David, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, David, we are moving towards a more digitized industry, but still labs can either utilize paper notebooks or electronic notebooks in the lab, of course. And what can you tell our listeners? How does the review process differ for each of these? And, what is the ideal process?
So it should be obvious, but notebooks are a very physical object, and physical makes a difference. So because reviewers have to have physical access to a notebook, you start with the idea that the scientist completes their work, and then they have to physically transfer the notebook to the reviewer. And then the reviewer will go off for some period of time reviewing a notebook. And then if there are edits or something which needs to be changed, it has to go back physically to the scientist and then back again to the reviewer. And there could be an approval process associated with all of this. In each case, that physical object is being moved. And one of the interesting aspects of this is that notebooks used to be very big. They used to get, one person would fill their notebook for a long period of time. And what we found over time is that the notebooks have become slimmer and slimmer because that notebook is out of circulation for a period of time. It goes, you need to continue to work. The notebook is in the review process. You pick another notebook and start working. And reviews have taken longer and longer, especially for compliant organizations. And so that notebook's out of circulation longer. Notebooks have now become really thin, and often they're single purpose notebooks. So that's really one aspect. But another aspect is that you fill a notebook with different references to other things that you do in the laboratory, ancillary information around instruments. So for instance, there'd be an instrument logbook somewhere where you keep records of your instruments, and you would note that in your notebook, and the reviewer has to find that logbook and actually verify that the information in that notebook is available or correct. Other things are around standards. You may or may not create them in your notebook. So they may be in some general purpose standard or solution notebook, reference standards. All of those things are physical objects. And as a result, the reviewer has to be physically on site in the laboratory, able to have the notebook, but also be able to walk around and find the different ancillary pieces of information and verify them. So that has really changed with the electronic ELN LIMS. Electronic solutions allow you to be virtual. And so just the process of saying, I'm taking a notebook and I want it to be reviewed, it's simply changing a status on the document. There's no physical transfer. It's just change the status. The reviewer now knows that they have to do the review, and the scientist can continue to work in exactly the same product without having to essentially subdivide their work. And virtual has some other efficiency aspects in that person, the reviewer, you can have reviewers from other parts of your organization. first of all, your reviewer can stay at home and work, which is great in these times of COVID, but you can also have other parts of your organization chip in. If one part is a little less busy, they can take on the review from another site a few miles away or even across the coast. So you do get some benefits from virtualization and removing the physical. Another area.
And it seems like, David, I don't want to interrupt, but as you're just talking about like a physical notebook moving around the laboratory or around the facility, my heart is racing a little bit because, you know, when the things are moving around like that and being passed from person to person, you also run the risk of losing the notebook or misplacing the notebook or damaging the notebook in some way. And when all of your notes are in that one physical location, if that happens, I mean, that's a huge negative impact on the lab and on the person whose notebook is lost. So to me, obviously, the electronic notebooks seem to really reduce that risk.
Yeah, I think we've all heard stories about the notebook that got lost. Recently, one of our customers was telling us about a notebook that was sitting in a desk that had been the employee left after 10 years, and they found this notebook when they cleaned out the desk, and it had proprietary information in it that had not been reviewed, and not, you know, you can imagine the situations you get into.
Absolutely. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm just, I wanted to point that out because I know some of our listeners were probably thinking about that.
Yeah, another place where this is played out is around instrument data. Instrument data at one time, you know, there was instruments, it was easy to record what you measured on your instrument. Now they come to pages of information. And in the paper world, that information used to be pasted into a notebook. It's now often printouts end up in a cabinet, or they are electronically stored on some file share. Either way, those are now disparate pieces of information that are not really associated with the notebook. They're referenced, but to really get a hold of it, you got to make some kind of an effort to find that information. And of course, again, it could be lost, as you said before. The virtual world, you expect that documentation to be stored right alongside with your notebook. You should be able to open it. It's secure along with the notebook. Another area that's really changed is in calculations. In the bad old days, you had a few calculations, just a few data points, and you could record them in your notebook manually. As the number of data points increased, and it's gone exponential, really, that was not tenable, and people started using spreadsheets. And spreadsheets have the huge advantage of doing lots of calculations very quickly. And at one time they were pasted into the notebook, then they went to file shares. There's different solutions for that problem.
Right.
But regardless, the spreadsheets bring their own problem, which is the FDA has audited many organizations, and there are many examples of spreadsheet compliance. So in the electronic media, again, when you get to ELN and LIMS, the calculations are integral to the process. They're validated along with the rest of the system, and therefore you don't have the compliance concerns that spreadsheets bring. Although spreadsheets are great, they're wonderful advance. So that's pretty much what I would say is the differences between paper and electronic.
Excellent, thank you. So, you know, thinking about all of the various labs, I'm sure that you come in contact with, review processes can vary depending on the regulatory requirements of the lab. Can you explain how a non-GXP lab reviews their work as compared to a GXP compliant lab?
So I think review is really, the goal of any review is that the scientists can reproduce their work, or some other scientists can reproduce the work, or the organization has the ability to reproduce that at some future date. So the review process is really focused on the ability to reproduce the work. And that is really, and the other thing, of course, that the results are accurate. You want to be sure that whatever information you're using has some level of accuracy. And that's really across all laboratories. I don't think there's any, even non-GXP laboratories, that type of review, and it's really called scientific review, is it's ubiquitous across all labs. And so that process remains regardless. When you have a GXP laboratory, which requires compliance, you bring in a level of dotting all your I's and crossing all your T's. Did you reference every piece of equipment you used? Did you put the lot number down for a particular material? And that is obviously an additional burden, both to the person who compiles the work, but also to the person that has to review it. And finally, there's intellectual property, which this is not an area that I really understand fully, but in the past, you had to witness work. That was a different style of review, but that still exists to some extent, although it's changing. And in most solutions, electronic solutions, you'll find that there are different levels review classifications, and those review classifications start with and essentially the review has to be done prior to completing a document or completing a notebook. And it can be self-review, which means that essentially when you're done, you're done. And that's a level that's applied to any work that has no impact on the organization. For instance, method development is something that you may want to do. It's of use, but it's not something that's ever going to end up in a regulatory document, or you're going to continue that work until you get to something that actually is you're going to use. And so self-review, you can say, when I'm done, I'm happy with that. But very often, most information is peer reviewed, meaning either another scientist comes in and talks or reviews, or you may have a supervisor, or you may have a separate review team that does the review. Either way, they're doing a level of peer review, which is either scientific or scientific and compliance. The last level of classification is approval. This is mainly for things that are going to clinical or production batches. In that case, you want QA, quality assurance, to come in and stamp your work as being approved.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So thinking about the electronic solutions, because we are talking about electronic notebooks and other electronic documents. The FDA has guidance around that, CFR Part 11, and compliance to stay compliant with that requirement. Obviously, requires that electronic solutions are validated, that we retain those records and have some sort of audit trail for not only regulators to review, but also for internal teams to do internal audits. And then there's a bunch of other requirements as well that are attached to CFR Part 11. How does that particular review process, and specifically the audit trail, play a role in maintaining this type of compliance, and for who is this type of compliance necessary?
In the paper world, I guess everyone's familiar with the scientist will sign at the bottom of the document.
Right.
And they'll date what they did. And if you make a change to a document, you're supposed to change to a notebook, you're supposed to cross it off or line through it and put why you changed it, sign and date it. So all of that is intended to show, it's intended to give you a level of custody. This is what happened to this document over a period of time. And it works pretty well. So when electronic systems were first introduced, the question was, how do we reproduce that very excellent process within the electronic world? And the answer was the audit trail. And the audit trail does exactly that. It documents what was done, who did it, when it was done. And if you make a change, it documents what changed. Now, importantly, the audit trail should be very visible, meaning you shouldn't have to dive in and find that information through multiple screens. What you really want is, just like paper, you want it to be very visible. This was done at this time by this particular person, and if it was changed, that it was changed, and what that change was and why. So the audit trail does exactly that, and it complies. It's a part of the compliance with Part 11. That compliance is really, according to the FDA, it's anybody that works in pharmaceuticals, if you work in the food industry or in medical devices, all of those are applicable. And within those organizations, there are certain records that are applicable. Not everything you do has to be Part 11 compliant, but anytime you're making a regulatory filing, any data associated with that is impacted if you make clinical or manufactured product. And the real kicker is that any decisions you make, any data that you base decisions on, is also included in Part 11 compliance. So it's a pretty broad suite and to be honest, once you do it in an electronic system, it pretty much is transparent to the user, and you might as well extend it to everything you do. If part of your organization is compliant, you might as well make the entire organization compliant. There's really very little extra effort involved.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, Part 11 is something that most quality departments are used to dealing with, especially our systems people. So again, that's not new, and it definitely the more consistent you can make it across departments, the easier it is for all of the teams, but also the regulatory agents coming in for inspections. So just thinking about laboratories separately from the rest of the organization, understanding that we're going to try to apply the same systems across all departments. Are there any records that need to be reviewed that might be different or unique to labs as opposed to the manufacturing facility?
So manufacturing has some additional requirements because the process is very exacting, and often you have non-scientific people taking measurements. You typically have a witness of everything that happens within the manufacturing process. So that's very different. In the scientific world, you assume, you don't assume, you have scientists who have credentials or training that essentially specifies they can do the work and they can do it without supervision. In the manufacturing space, you do require a level of overview. But generally, the information that needs to be reviewed in either case is any instrument data, or anything that is generated to support the work that you're doing. Any calculations. Calculations are one of the areas that seem to always have issues. Calculations are difficult. There are notes that are made, essentially excursion events. If you have a process and you're following a process, everything's great. But if you have some kind of a note associated with it, usually that means you've had to deviate to some extent from the expected process. And those notes are key to making sure you review them and you understand the impact of them. And then, of course, you have to review calibration and expiration dates. But essentially, the two are very similar, just with a few extra requirements around the manufacturing space.
So thinking a little bit more about the electronic solutions, we understand that electronic solutions prevent scientists, engineers, whomever's working in the pharmaceutical lab or facility from hiding or manipulating data, changing it for whatever purpose. How does that review process in the lab ensure that this doesn't occur?
We have, many of us have been witness to having a scientist be walked out of the laboratory and find out later that it's because data was falsified. That happened a lot more in In the past, it happens certainly with an electronic solution, it happens much, it's rare. And the reason is that in order to falsify data, usually what happens is the person doesn't want to do the work or comes up with a result that doesn't match expectations and essentially changes the data to match expectations or to get the work done quickly. And when you have timestamps, an audit trail on everything that you do, so you know at the point that you're preparing a sample, you know that when you took a balance reading, then you know that you had to put that sample on an instrument, and 2 hours later you're going to get a result. You have to be very careful if you're falsifying. It's very difficult actually to keep all your timestamps straight and make sure that they would fall into the category of that they wouldn't be obviously falsified. And of course, instrument data now flows directly to the notebooks. In the electronic world, it's very hard to falsify electronic instrument data. So those two things have cut down on the occurrence. And I will tell you one story. When I was with an organization, they created an R&D team in a country that was coming. It was just really coming into its own, and they put a lot of pressure on that R&D organization to get the results, get do a lot, get it, get this product through, and that pressure caused falsification of data. Mm-hmm. And the electronic system that they used eventually pointed to that. They were able to find it. They were able to essentially they had to flush the product. They couldn't use the product, and they eventually closed the organization or that site. But it is something that happens. It's something to be aware of, and it's if you're still in paper, that's something you would be at risk of.
Right. Absolutely. Unfortunately, it does happen. Not that often. I think most people get up each day going to work, trying to do their best and produce the best products and the best data that they can. But sometimes there are some external pressures which cause us all to do things we wouldn't normally do. So I'm glad it's not the norm, but it does happen.
Well, one thing also that's happening is because you have these large teams, and you've got may have 50 people working on a particular product, depending on its complexity. All it takes is one person, out of that team, and all of the work that you did is at risk. So it's
right, absolutely. So thinking about the team, and they can be quite large, how does the review process fit in with the totality of the lab? Or in other words, how does lab personnel know that a sample has been released for use or that data can be used in reporting? Maybe it's a little bit more obvious with the electronic notebooks than it is with the regular notebooks, but can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, going back to the paper world, essentially you knew that a notebook was ready for review when it showed up on your desk. The physical object would show up on your desk. You knew it was time to review, and if you had rework or it would go back to the scientist, it was, that was the messaging system. Sometimes you would send an email. In electronic systems, everything is status, meaning that you start with you're in process until the notebook is ready for review. It gets a change of status, and at that point you can message. You can message either internally within the system. You can message through email, and you also have the ability to look across all of the notebooks that are in the system. So what you can do is show me all the notebooks that need to be reviewed, and it's a clear query. It lets you know exactly what needs to be done. You can also do things from a compliance perspective of knowing how many notebooks you have that are 30 days or more. Typically, you have to review a notebook in some set amount of time. So having queries that let you know that is very useful. And all this is because you're electronically statusing the notebook. The other part to that is that the results that come from a notebook are also status. So if you do very often you have multiple people working on, let's say, a batch release. So you're releasing a batch, it may have a moisture experiment, impurities, assay, whatever. And one person works on their moisture results and they get that reviewed. So the nice part about an electronic system is that the results, that moisture result, can individually be approved and ready for reporting. And the assay may be held up for a week or two, but you get a status that's linked directly to the result, and that's an important aspect. The other thing is you have results that are available immediately. As soon as the result is recorded, it's available for in-process. I would call it just look-sees, where you can see if a data point is in or out of expected range. So it gives you a quick look. It's not something that you would put out and you would obviously wait until it's approved before you make any decisions on it, but it lets you at least understand whether your process is in control or not.
So in addition to the change of status and maybe the message that is generated, are there any particular steps that lab personnel need to take to ensure that the handoff between the author and the reviewer or the approver goes seamlessly?
So again, back to the paper world, the communication between the reviewer and the scientist. So a reviewer finds issues in a write-up and wants something corrected. The way it worked is you put a sticky note on your paper notebook, and we often saw paper notebooks with literally 20 or 30 sticky notes on them. It looked like a porcupine on a notebook. And that notebook would then be passed back to the scientist. The scientist would make the changes, and each sticky note would be replied to or sometimes just tossed off. The electronic world has made that process more efficient in that sticky notes can't be lost. The communication is verifiable. And in addition, when you complete a document, all the sticky notes are removed automatically, so you don't have any hangovers. When you go to an audit, you know that everything in the document has been scrubbed before you hand that document to a reviewer or an auditor.
So thinking still about electronic solutions, you've mentioned LIMS or ELN systems. How do those better support the need for multiple reviewers or many hands touching the documents?
Right. That's what used to happen is you could have multiple reviewers of paper notebooks or bound notebooks. And the way you did that is you would sign at the bottom of the page as it was reviewed by me, and it was on this particular date. The problem is it's not a very efficient review. Page by page review means that if you have you have to check instrument calibration records and the instruments are across 2 or 3 pages. What you really want to do is go out and check all of your calibrations at one time, but you can't sign off at the bottom of the page because you haven't reviewed everything on that page. So what the electronic world brings is a more granular review process. So you can sign off if you reviewed all the instrument calibration due dates. You could come back and you could mark each one of those as being reviewed. And if you pass that off to another reviewer, they would be able to pick up exactly from where you started. The electronic system should show you that these records were already reviewed, and you would be able to continue without any having to re-review information. And it also allows you to pass documents quickly. Again, you don't have the physical aspect of it. So if I want to review part of it and pass it to another team to review something they're more expert in, it's a quick process back and forth.
So I think we've really covered what the difference between paper notebooks and electronic notebooks are. And we can see, obviously, we're going down this path. We can see that electronic solutions are much better in a lot of ways. And that's been part of the evolution. We've evolved, and we are still in the process of evolving our labs to be more digitally based. In your experience, how has the review process evolved, and what sorts of tricks have been implemented to make this whole review process go a little bit easier?
So one of the things that systems can now do is they can look for potential compliance problems and point out to the reviewer what they essentially can become expert systems. They can take a look at what is in the document or in the notebook, and they can look for potential excursions. So for instance, they can highlight any data that was changed. Often change data, if you make a change, there's a reason you made the change and it's usually not good. Well, sometimes it's okay, but you want that highlighted. So having systems that highlight that. You want to know if someone used an expired solution. You want to, it should be flagged. There may be a reason for doing it, but let's flag it. You want to know that instruments are past their calibration due dates. There's just a lot of little issues that can be, that electronic systems can flag up and let the reviewer concentrate more on the science and less on the crossing the T's and dotting the I's.
Excellent. So I think we have a great overview. We've gotten a great overview from you today on sort of this whole laboratory review process. But as we prepare to wrap up for the day, just want to see if there's any last thoughts or action items that you'd like to leave with our listeners.
Yeah, I think one of the things we haven't talked about is really the advent of templating within electronic systems. So when you do paper, again, you start with a blank page. Sometimes you can have pre-printed forms, but paper it's hard to come up with a templated system. In electronics medium, you have the ability to have a templated system that it pre-formats your calculations. They're all embedded in the system. They're validated. You can make sure that everything you do is that your documentation is comprehensive, meaning you can put pre-existing slots for all of the information that needs to be addressed, pro forma. And finally, it's easy to read. If you have 3 scientists, you have 3 different ways of documenting the work. And that makes it very hard for a reviewer. It makes it very hard for anyone else who's trying to glean information from that record. So when you go to the extra step of implementing an electronic system and templating your work, you get tremendous efficiencies, especially for the reviewer. Reviews have been documented to your efficiency can increase by about 30%, which is significant and reduces backlog. And again, I go back to that picture of notebooks stacked within a hallway. At least removing 30% of that would be helpful. And I want to encourage people to move to the electronic media, because in the old days, maintenance versus benefit, LIMS, old style LIMS systems are very difficult to maintain. They take a lot of effort, and sometimes the benefit didn't match the effort. Currently, systems have evolved tremendously, and the maintenance now has been reduced and the benefit has been increased. And I think that ratio is now very different.
Yeah, I love the idea of templates because in addition to the efficiencies that it brings a consistency to the documentation recording of the entire team, right? So now people across business units, or even in different geographic parts of the world, are reporting in much of the same way because they're using these templates. So, and I think there's a large benefit for not only labs, but manufacturing facilities as a whole in using something like that.
And I think that's an underrated benefit of the system, is that when you open up a templated system, you know what to expect, you know exactly where to go to get your information, and it's consistent across everything that's done. That has when you think about the number of people that need to use your information, it's probably 5 times as many people use it as actually record it. So, you're talking about a lot of gains in their time and their ability to understand the data.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, all of those things just reduce risks of, some sort of quality failure in your organization.
Exactly.
Excellent. Well, David, I really thank you again for being our guest today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I appreciate you lending insight into this topic.
Okay, thank you. We appreciate being here.
Absolutely. I also want to give a shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. And most importantly, I'm sending out my thanks to you, our valued listeners. I appreciate your time each week. Please take a moment to rate and review the show in your podcast player of choice, and be sure to share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks so they can enjoy it too. For show notes and additional podcast resources, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. Until next time, make it a great week.